Welcome back to the Unseen Podcast, a podcast dedicated to missing people, unresolved cases, and UK true crime. Today we are delving into a sad story that seems as though it could have stepped right off the pages of an Agatha Christie novel. The disappearance of Edwin Rose on the Scottish island of Arran in 1889 was shrouded in intrigue and would later come to be known as the Arran Mystery. Today's case is a listener suggestion from Barbara on Facebook, so thank you for that. As always, this episode contains descriptions that some listeners may find distressing, so listener discretion is advised. The Isle of Arran is located just off the coast of Scotland in the Firth of Clyde. It's the 7th largest island in Scotland, and in 2011 there were just over 4,000 residents living there. The island has been famous for the many geological discoveries that have been made there over the years. Tourists have continued to visit the island to observe the Arran Hills, one of the most famous being Goatfell, and also to see the glens on the island. In 1889 this was also the case, and people from around the UK travelled to Scotland and to the Isle of Arran to enjoy the scenery and see the sights. One of these tourists was 32-year-old Edwin Rose. He was a builder's clerk who lived in the South London suburb of Upper Tooting and who had decided to take a summer holiday up to the Isle of Arran. This was a popular activity in the area, and Edwin was one of a number of tourists traversing the area. It was July 1889 and the area was basking in summer sunshine. One of the popular things to do during this time was to get a steamer boat down the Clyde and visit different ports on the island along the way. This was something that Edwin had decided to do, and he was one of several tourists aboard the boat Ivanhoe that took them on the journey. It was known that while Edwin was on holiday, he also met several other tourists along the way. It appeared that Edwin was having a good trip, and there wasn't any indication that he had come across any problems. This was until the 18th of July. This was the date that Edwin was due home in London from his trip. It's reported that his brother Benjamin went to the station to meet him, however he never turned up. This was alarming as his brother was sure that he should have been returning that day. He began to wonder where he could have got to. Benjamin decided to contact an acquaintance of theirs, Reverend Goodman, who had told Edwin to visit the area. Reverend Goodman had received a letter from him on the 16th of July, explaining he was staying at a place called Mrs. Walker's in Brodick, which is on the Isle of Arran. He explained that he would be back for his letters and to say goodbye to him. This also didn't happen. Reverend Goodman then received a telegram from Edwin's brother to say that he had not returned to London. This was concerning as it seemed that he had not returned at all from Arran. As he had been told by Edwin that he was at a place called Mrs. Walker's in Brodick, he decided to follow up on that lead. Soon after, however, he would contact police, as the information provided by the landlady proved to be suspicious. The police were contacted about Edwin Rose's disappearance, and they began to investigate what could have happened to him. Newspapers at the time began to report with headlines such as that in the Aberdeen Evening Press, "Mysterious Disappearance of a Tourist." The information provided by the landlady in Brodick proved to be crucial information, as she reported that Edwin had arrived in Brodick from Port Bannatyne on the 13th of July. He had come with another man who gave his name as Annandale. They got a room for a week. The landlady explained that they headed up the ascent of Goatfell on the Monday afternoon, and it was known that they were met by a party who were coming down at about 4 o'clock. Unfortunately, after this she had not seen Edwin again. The landlady then said she checked on the room on the Tuesday, however she didn't find anyone in there. All that was left was an old coat and a hat, which she remembered had belonged to the man named Annandale. The police now had a lead to go on and decided to see if they could find this man. This was crucial as it seemed that despite Edwin not knowing this man, he had decided to travel part of his journey with him. Police were able to find out that Annandale travelled to Port Bannatyne on the Tuesday night, and stayed until the Saturday. Port Bannatyne is on the nearby island of Bute and required Annandale to get a ferry. He then left without paying for his stay and had not returned there since. This behaviour was certainly strange, and the police were convinced their answer lay with this man. The investigation, however, had to also focus on finding Edwin. They were at this time unsure what could have actually happened to him. The local police force set up a search party, which also included constables and volunteers. It was led by Captain Mackay, and they searched the hills around Goatfell looking for any sign of Edwin. They were aware that Goatfell could be very dangerous and wanted to completely search that area. At this point, they weren't sure where Edwin was, and it was certainly plausible that he could have had an accident on the steep hills. The Dundee Courier on the 5th of August 1889 reported that 150 people made a search on Goatfell and on a nearby mountain close to it. It was during this search that one of the members of the search party, Frank Logan, began to smell a horrific odour. The smell appeared to be coming from a large boulder, close to where the search party had been looking. Frank Logan looked into the crevice underneath the boulder, and after removing some small stones, he was able to see the body of a man underneath. It was soon ascertained that this was the body of Edwin Rose. He was lying on his front, and it appeared that he had been thrown down from the top of the mountain. The police analysed the scene and concluded that he must have then been dragged a considerable distance, and was then hidden beneath the rocks, as a way of concealing the body. It was clear that without the smell, the search party may never have come across the body. After the discovery, Edwin's brother Benjamin was asked to identify it, which he did, and positively identified him as Edwin. It had been 3 weeks since Edwin's disappearance, and the police now had the huge job of trying to piece together what exactly had happened and who had committed this murder. The area in which the body was found was a very remote part of the island, and it was clear that Edwin and the perpetrator had strayed quite far out from the usual walking routes. The police had one clear suspect in the murder, the man called Annandale, who had been seen with Edwin the day that he had last been seen, and was known to have headed up to Goatfell with him. It was clear that someone had returned to the lodgings and taken away Edwin's belongings, and the only other person who would have had the capability of carrying this out was Annandale. This provided a motive for Edwin's murder and also made him the number one suspect. The problem was that the police didn't know where he was, and he had a 3-week head start. The police published a brief description of the man, along with the fact that he liked to be fashionable and enjoyed wearing knickerbockers. This, they hoped, would be an identifying feature if anyone saw him. While the police investigation continued, Edwin's body was removed for a post-mortem to determine his cause of death. The investigation revealed that Edwin and Annandale had been seen at Goatfell before Edwin's murder. It's reported in the St James Gazette that the two men had been last seen by a Mr McCabe Hamilton and a Reverend Mr Ritson, who had crossed paths with Edwin and Annandale as they headed to the crest of the mountain. The men said that Annandale appeared to be leading the party. They stopped for some shelter as a rain shower came down, but Edwin and Annandale left soon afterwards, with other witnesses claiming that they saw them at the top of the mountain. This seemed to be the last sighting of the pair and the last sighting of Edwin alive. As the investigation continued, information came out that Annandale may not actually be the perpetrator's name, and that this was in fact an alias. The Dundee Evening Telegraph reported that it had been discovered that the man they had previously known as Annandale was actually living at North Frederick Street in Glasgow. The shocking part of the story was that the police believed they now knew his real identity: 25-year-old Scotsman John Lorry. According to the article in the Telegraph published on the 7th of August, a co-worker of Lorry's from the Sharp, Stewart and Co.'s Atlas Locomotive Engine Works saw him in Rothsay on the Isle of Bute. He said that he saw Lorry and noticed his resemblance to the description given of the man named Annandale. He also reported that Lorry had abruptly left his job on the 31st of July and demanded his pay. He explained that he had been offered a better opportunity. Lorry's co-worker decided to give this tip to the police. The police decided to investigate it further and managed to find more information that appeared to implicate John Lorry in the crime. The Aberdeen Evening Express on the 6th of August stated that Lorry had written a letter to his landlady in Glasgow on the 2nd of August, explaining that someone had been trying to get him into trouble, and she shouldn't answer any questions about him if anyone asked. This seemed increasingly suspicious to the police, as it seemed as though Laurie was covering his tracks if anyone came asking about him. This was also coupled with the information that co-workers provided that Laurie had admitted to them that he had been at Goatfell. The police were now armed with the information that on the 2nd of August, Laurie had sent the letter to his landlady from Hamilton, a town 12 miles from Glasgow. Another development came 2 days later when it was reported that a bag had been found at a Glasgow office with an address on it that had been rubbed off. This had belonged to Edwin Rose. This was yet another link which seemed to connect Edwin with places that John Laurie had been staying. The newspapers ran multiple stories about John Laurie, and people came forward to talk about his life. People who Laurie had been at school with came forward to explain that he was quiet and sedate, and took part in the singing and Bible classes while at school. He was not known as a violent person and never showed any signs of aggression, even when taking part in physical activities such as sports. He seemed to have good relationships with school friends and through into adulthood in his work. This seemed at odds with what he was now being accused of, but circumstantial evidence was mounting up against him. On the 13th of August, a letter was published by several newspapers, including the Aberdeen Press and Journal, that had been received by the Glasgow Mail. It had been written by John Laurie. The letter had a Liverpool postmark and was dated August the 10th. Dear Editor, I feel that I should write a long detailed letter to your newspaper, but I am in no mood to do so. I rather smile when I read that my arrest is hourly expected. If things go as I have designed them, I will have soon arrived at a country from whose bourne no traveller returns. And since there has been so much said about me, it is only right that the public should know what are the real circumstances which has brought me to this. Laurie then goes on to explain that the reason he went to Rothesay was to, quote, watch the audacious behaviour of a woman that he had become acquainted with, who had been encouraging the attentions of another man. This, he said, he had done this year and last year. He then went on to talk about Edwin. He explained that as regards Mr. Rose, poor fellow, no one who knows me will believe for one moment that I had any complicity in his death. The morning I left for Arran, I was in the company of 2 friends on Rothesay Pier, when Mr. Rose came up to me and said he was going to spend a few days with me at Arran. I was very much surprised at this, as my friends could vouch for. I had not invited him. We went to the top of Goatfell, where I left him in the company of 2 men who came from Loch Ranza and were going back to Brodick. I went to Corrie and met some friends, and we afterwards visited the hotel, where we met several gentlemen who were camping out. I left Brodick about 10. I could easily prove that what I say is true, but I decline to bring the names of my friends into this disgraceful affair, so will content by wishing them a last adieu. The newspapers questioned whether the letter was genuine, as it was reported that he had signed it off differently to his other letters, and that the handwriting looked disguised. Glasgow police, however, confirmed that they believed the letter to be genuine, and they believed that they knew that Laurie had gone to Liverpool and then travelled back up to Scotland. This seemed to be corroborated by the fact that at the end of August another letter was received by a Glasgow newspaper. This letter had an Aberdeen postmark. Once again Laurie asserted his innocence, but said that he had been in Liverpool. He explained that no one he knew had seen him in different places in Scotland and said it was all imagination. He stated that he was not going to give himself up, as he was now a wanted man. This once again appeared to confirm that it was indeed Laurie who had written both of the letters. The police were again on the trail of Laurie, but they only had the information that was now at least a few days old. A publican who lived in Aberdeen explained that Laurie had stayed at his boarding house. He showed them a piece of paper that Laurie had lent on to write a letter, and some words from the letter sent to the newspaper could be made out underneath. The publican explained that he did recognise Laurie as being the man that they were looking for, however did not confront him. At the beginning of September, a dramatic set of events occurred. Around 3 miles from Hamilton, Laurie was spotted by several people who recognised him as the man that police were looking for. He appeared wary, however when he realised he had been spotted, he gave chase. The station master of a nearby train station that Laurie had approached immediately contacted a policeman. The constable quickly gave chase, and both he and Laurie ran for a while, eventually ending up at a place called Bog Colliery. The constable shouted to the workmen who surrounded the area. The constable explained that he then said to Laurie, "John, it's all up now." He then reportedly replied, "It is. I've cut my throat." The constable found Laurie in a bush with his throat cut and a razor in his hand. The constable bandaged up his throat and then transported him to the county police office. He was then transferred to Rothesay. Prior to his transfer, it's reported that Laurie discussed that he had travelled all over Scotland and England in an attempt to evade police, however had now run out of money. He also explained that he had attempted to commit suicide a few times before by taking poison, however it hadn't worked and he had vomited it back up. On the 12th of September, John Laurie was committed to trial for the murder of Edwin Rose. It's known that Laurie looked pale as this was read out and that he passed out in court. The trial was eagerly awaited by the public who had followed the story closely, and his manhunt that had been one of the biggest for years. His trial began on November the 8th in Edinburgh, before Lord Kingsborough, the Lord Justice Clerk. The prosecution produced their witnesses on the first day, led by the Solicitor General for Scotland. Mr. J.B. Balfour led the defence. The prosecution brought forward Benjamin Rose, Edwin's brother, who explained that Edwin was very healthy and happy before his death. They also brought forward a sergeant from the Rothesay police who was there when Edwin's body was found. He explained that the body had been found under 42 rocks and that his head had been covered with a coat. The defence cross-examined the police officer and questioned him about Edwin's boots. The boots had been found on the body, however had since been buried by the police. When questioned as to why this had been done, a constable said that they weren't needed anymore as a positive identification had been made. The defence were interested in the boots as it was believed that they had iron heels, which would have been very slippy on the rocks at Goatfell. They put forward that Edwin may have slipped and banged his head on the rocks. They also questioned why the police would have buried the boots so quickly after finding the body. The prosecution refuted this and put forward Dr. Gilmore, who conducted the post-mortem. He said that the injuries on Edwin's body were caused by a number of blows from a heavy blunt instrument, such as a boulder, and were not consistent with a fall. It was presented by the prosecution that Laurie had travelled with Edwin under the false name of Annandale and that he had gone up to Goatfell where he was seen by witnesses. While Edwin's murder was not witnessed by anyone, it was clear that Laurie returned without Edwin and then their bags were later removed from their room. He then proceeded to move around both Scotland and England to evade the police, while sending in letters to newspapers, confessing that he was indeed with Edwin at Goatfell. It was determined that Edwin had died from blows to the head and that it was intentional and not a fall. There was also the fact that his body had been covered over and his head had been covered with a coat. Mr. Balfour for the defence proclaimed that a murder had not taken place, and cast doubt on the fact that the police had covered up evidence, i.e. the boots. He also stated that Laurie's suspicious behaviour was a direct response to the incriminating statements that were being made in the newspapers, and not of his guilt. While it was clear that Laurie had robbed Edwin as he had some of his possessions, there was nothing such as blood found on any of his clothes that suggested that he had beaten Edwin to death, as was suggested by the prosecution. The jury had to decide what they believed happened to Edwin. Did Laurie murder him in cold blood and steal from him, or did Edwin slip, fall, and Laurie, in a very opportunistic way, robbed him and covered up his death? Either way, it didn't look good for Laurie, however the jury had a decision to make about whether it was murder. They deliberated for 45 minutes and returned to the court. They had found John Laurie guilty of Edwin Rose's murder by a majority of one person, 8 people to 7. Lord Kingsborough stated after the verdict, "You have been convicted by the jury of one of the most terrible crimes that our country has ever known. You must be well aware that the conviction can only be followed by one sentence, which it is my sad duty to pronounce. I beseech you to turn away your thoughts from this world. Justice for the crime you have committed ends here. I beseech you to repent for your crime and turn to the God whom you have offended. In respect of the foregoing verdict, the Lord Justice Clerk discerns and adjudges the said John Watson Lorry, the panel, to be carried from the bar to the prison of Edinburgh, thence to be conveyed and transmitted to the prison of Greenock, thereafter to be detained till the 30th day of November, and upon that day between the hours of 8 and 10 o'clock forenoon, to be placed in the hands of the executioner, to be hanged by the neck until he is dead. It is reported in the Dundee Courier that the Lord Justice Clerk was more than once affected by the passing of the sentence. When it was done, Lorry turned to the court and stated, "Ladies and gentlemen, I am innocent of this charge." Lord Kingsborough warned Lorry that he could not address the court, and he was led away. Immediately after the sentence was passed, the public began to discuss the death penalty and whether it was applicable in this case. The reason was that the majority of one that had been secured at the trial didn't seem large enough to sentence a man to death. A petition to commute the death sentence was produced and did have the support of various members of the public, including religious members who preached their opinions at several churches. Lord Lothian was charged with investigating whether the death sentence was indeed appropriate in this situation, and Lorry was examined by a doctor to ascertain his mental state. There was also the fact that there appeared to be a lack of motive in the murder, and no explanation was given for this by the prosecution. It was reported on the 29th of November that Lord Lothian, after careful inquiry, had decided that Lorry was of unsound mind and needed to be respited. This meant that Lorry's conviction for murder would still stand, however he would now not be sent to death, but remain in prison. This was a difficult decision for anyone who had been following the case. For those that wanted his pardon, it was just, and for those that believed he had murdered Edwin in cold blood, it felt like he had escaped justice. There were other things taken into account, for instance, the fact that only circumstantial evidence could be found, and the slim majority that the conviction had gained. Lorry continued to protest his innocence right up until his death in 1930 at the age of 69. He died in what was then called the Lunatic Division of Perth Prison. The issues surrounding the trial that were brought up in 1889 still shroud the case today. The fact that the case was based entirely on circumstantial evidence always leaves room for some doubt. The medical evidence presented at the time that Edwin had been battered to death did not match other evidence which was presented by the Queen's surgeon, Patrick Watson. There was also the lack of any reasonable motive. Lorry had not been a violent person, so would he have murdered Edwin in such a brutal way just to rob him? There are of course arguments on both sides. Lorry did appear to go on the run, he had used a false name, and he did later admit to robbing Edwin. This is a controversial case, as some believe that there wasn't enough evidence to convict him at all, and that it was actually a miscarriage of justice. Some, no doubt, believe completely in his guilt, as I believe the police officers at the time did. It is certain that a sad event happened at Goatfell that day, regardless if it was murder or if a terrible accident befell Edwin. Edwin's family mourned his loss, and the horrific way in which his body was found did not give them any comfort. Edwin Rose was later buried at Glensannock's Kirkyard in Scotland. Despite the possible differing opinions about what happened to him, it is so important to remember that a young man died in an awful situation. Thank you for listening to today's episode, and I am so interested to know what your theories are about this case. If you do want to support the podcast, there are a few ways you can do this. You can support us on Patreon, which helps to keep the podcast going, and I am so appreciative of everyone that does support us. You can also review the podcast wherever you listen. This also gets us noticed by more people. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter, or just tell some of your friends about the podcast. I love seeing your recommendations and love hearing your thoughts. If you want to send us a suggestion like today's episode has been, then please do on social media or at theunseenpod@gmail.com. Thank you for all your support. Once again, thanks for listening. I'm Caprice, and this has been Unseen.